give you a proper introduction. As I explained to others before you came in, there's been an accident and an ambulance is quietly coming away. So lunch is delayed a little bit. Now, I'm not going to belabor this long introduction, but I am going to tell you that we are very privileged today, as I'm sure you know, to have Dr. Peter Salk, the eldest son of Dr. Jonas Salk, himself a physician who practices in La Jolla, California, and he came all the way from California just to be with us today. And I would just like to say one more word. It's a subject very dear to my heart, and I hope to everybody in the room, that we deal not just with post-polio, but that we be concerned about new polio throughout the world, and about those young people who are getting polio still in other countries. So I know that you have big hearts, and so I think this is part of our mission. I would like to think that you agree that it isn't just taking care of ourselves, but it's helping others. And I think the perfect person to talk about that is Dr. Peter Salk, and here he is.
Well, Jean, thank you so much for the introduction, and to you and to John and your colleagues for having invited me to come here. I may speak quietly, so please let me know if for some reason my voice isn't heard. It actually it's very moving for me to be here with you to experience some of your experiences and to get a sense of the character of you as individuals and how the experiences that you have had dealing with the challenges and the disabilities that you have faced have come to shape your character into such extraordinary people. It was such a pleasure last evening to have dinner with a small group of you and to just see firsthand what you have become and how strong you have been internally and the breadth of character that you carry. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be among you and to have an opportunity to share with you some of the story that I would like to share. Actually, Lee, I may have forgotten to pick up, if you gave me the clicker, I may have
it might be on the podium.
Okay. It is. So do I just push the first slide to get it started? Oh, I pushed it. What do I do? To get the beginning.
It's got to warm up.
Okay. What I want to talk to you about today stems from the experience that I've had with my father, who you know in the capacity of having worked on with his research team the development of the first polio vaccine. So you may know that about my father, but there are other aspects of his life that haven't been known so much. And what I'd like to do is to start towards the beginning, move through some of his life and the work that he did, and then especially to share some of the thinking of the later part of his life and put that into the perspective of where things now stand with respect to the continuation of polio in the world. So, and this year is a special year in that on October 28th, that would have been my father's 100th birthday. So we're celebrating the centenary of his birth this year leading up to that time, and then we'll take the opportunity of the time from October of this year through October of next to continue activities that relate to his life, to his interests, and particularly to the forward-looking aspects of what do we all need to do from here if we want to make this world the kind of place that we would like to see it be. From the time that my father was very young, he knew that he wanted to do something to help the world. This was a deep motivation on his part. His initial thought had been that he might go into the practice of law and become a congressman to help change the laws that govern our lives. His mother was discouraging to him about that. Perhaps she might have been happier had he become a rabbi, and said to him, "How can you think of becoming a lawyer if you can't even win an argument with me?" That was a convincing piece of logic. And my father went on to City College in New York, still with that intention, but 1 year took a chemistry course, and that changed his life. He was just captivated by what science had to offer, the way of thinking, the potential to do things with it that could make big differences in life, and that was what he ended up pursuing. He went on to medical school at New York University School of Medicine, and there he had an experience that set him on a course that made a big difference for him. And that was that 1 year he was taking a microbiology course, and the professor was talking about vaccines against diphtheria and tetanus, two bacterial diseases, where you can deal with preventing the problems in those diseases by vaccines that consist of taking some of the bacterial components and inactivating the toxic materials and convert them to a non-toxic form, which you can then use as a vaccine to immunize against the disease. Then in the next lecture, the professor said, when it comes to viral illnesses, diseases caused by viruses, you can't do that. You need to have a living virus in order to induce protective immunity. And my father just didn't understand why that should be. He said to himself, both those statements can't be true. So that gave him the intellectual stimulus to pursue that angle. And while he was in medical school, he had an opportunity to do some work along with one of the researchers there. The man on the left is Thomas Francis, who was himself interested in that same question and was working towards the idea of developing an inactivated or killed virus vaccine against influenza. After my father graduated from medical school and did 2 years of hospital work, he then went to Ann Arbor, Michigan to work with Dr. Francis on a killed vaccine against influenza. And that project was completed successfully. The first influenza vaccine was used at the end of World War II and became the model for all of the injected influenza vaccines that still are in use today. They become more refined, but all based on that same initial success and that same principle. After the time that he spent in Ann Arbor, my father went on to the University of Pittsburgh in 1947, intending to continue work on influenza and perfecting that vaccine. But this was in a time when, as you all are well aware, polio was a huge problem in this country.
Oh, yes.
The March of Dimes, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, had been established by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and under the leadership of his good friend and law partner, Basil O'Connor. Money was raised to do all sorts of things related to polio, both in terms of care and treatment, but also focus on research towards developing a polio vaccine. My father had a knock on the door from Harry Weaver, who was then the director of research at the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, asking whether he might consider turning his new laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh in the direction of polio, being one of the teams, there were several teams that were trying to determine how many different types of poliovirus there were, because if you were going to make a successful vaccine, you had to include each of the types of poliovirus. It was known that there were 3 types, but it wasn't known whether there were at least 3 types. It wasn't known whether there were more. My father agreed to do this, saw this as an opportunity, even though the work, that initial project was a very boring one, very tedious and time-consuming. But it actually, he and his team developed some ways of doing things more quickly that led directly to the idea of an inactivated vaccine against polio. He gathered a team of very skilled researchers who you see there. Looking at them individually, this was Dr. Julius Youngner, working with one of his technicians, Ruth Hightower. On the left is Byron Bennett, and on the right is Jim Lewis, 2 of the other scientists in the team. And this is my father, Val Baisley, who came in at a time when it was important to try and scale up the work that was going on in the laboratory. This is my father's longtime assistant, Lorraine Friedman, who not only worked with him in those early years, but then continued for many, many years to work closely with him. There are others I won't show you. This was the idea they were working on. Let me make sure I have the right button here. Yes, I do, but it may not be seen very well. On the top diagram represents what happens with a poliovirus infection if a person has not been immunized. So the virus will get in through the mouth, go down into the intestinal tract, where I'm afraid this is not going to help you very much to have this pointer. So on the bottom you see the virus with time going over to the right. The virus grows in the intestinal tract. Then at one point it can cross into the bloodstream, through the lymph system into the bloodstream, circulate in the bloodstream, and then from there get into the CNS, the central nervous system, the spinal cord in the brain, and that's where the damage is done. When it infects, as you've heard before from Dr. Glazer's talk, the anterior horn cells, the nerves that control the muscles, and that the damage to those nerves is what causes the paralysis. Now, after some time, the body produces antibodies against the poliovirus, and these are materials that circulate in the bloodstream that can inactivate or kill the poliovirus. But it's too late, damage has been done. However, and then the virus continues to grow, and it is excreted in the feces and can be passed on. It can also be passed on through the mouth, through coughing and sneezing and so on at a certain stage of the infection. If, on the other hand, you have someone who's immunologically experienced, has had a poliovirus infection before, or the theory would be immunized with a vaccine, what happens is in the middle panel, which represents the middle section, which represents the bloodstream, antibodies, the potential to have antibodies are there. You can stimulate it. The body knows about the poliovirus. So when the virus gets into the intestinal tract, after a little bit of time, the body revs up its ability to produce those antibodies in the bloodstream. And by the time the virus would be able to get into the bloodstream, too late for the virus, the bloodstream is already full of antibodies, which prevent the virus from getting to the blood, and therefore the virus won't get to the nervous system. So that was the theory that they were working on. The work proceeded, first in animals, and it looked as if they were on the right track. They started work in 1952 at the Watson Home for Crippled Children, just outside of Pittsburgh, where they would take the poliovirus of the type that had infected and paralyzed to each child, either type 1 or type 2 or type 3, as a safety measure for the initial test. And what they were looking for was to see if you took this inactivated virus, which is very carefully inactivated to make sure it was killed and yet still preserve the ability to stimulate the immune system. They wanted to see whether the children, after being injected with this killed virus, would have a boost in their antibody levels. They already had antibody because they had had the infection, but they wanted to see whether the antibody levels would be boosted, and they were. So that gave the incentive to go on into experiments in kids who had not seen polio before, starting in the schools in Pittsburgh, and then very quickly, starting in 1954, actually the anniversary, the 60th anniversary of this occasion was yesterday, the beginning of the huge national field trial with 1.8 million children, polio pioneers, that either were injected with the experimental vaccine preparation or with a placebo that looked like the vaccine but wasn't, or just remained uninjected as observed controls. It took a year, almost a year, from the time that field trial started to the time the results were analyzed and announced, and interestingly enough, the person who was responsible for the design and the analysis of the results of that field trial was the same Tommy Francis with whom my father had worked at the University of Michigan, one of the top epidemiologists in this country, and this was his responsibility. So it was on April 12th in 1955 that Dr. Francis, whom you see at the right, announced the results of his very careful tests, and the vaccine indeed was determined to be safe, effective, and potent. So that changed life in an instant. The fear that had pervaded this country and the world was lifted. The vaccine was approved for use immediately and introduced. There were some hitches early on with some manufacturing difficulties that were overcome. And stop at that moment. Over the course of time, things changed dramatically. Now, I'm going to put the polio story on hold for a moment because things went quite well, and there's more of that story to tell, but I want to pick up the thread of what happened in my father's own life. He went back to his laboratory. Actually, it was quite a difficult situation for him right after Ann Arbor. He had the fantasy that he would just go back to his lab, go back to work, and that would be that. But there was a big hullabaloo and a lot of attention from the press and so on. It was very difficult to get back into the same groove that he had been in. He continued work on polio. He was beginning to be interested in some observations that had been made in the laboratory that seemed to have relevance to the cancer situation and how the immune system might be used to conceivably to help with cancer. But more than that, my father was concerned with a new idea, which was to create a new kind of research institute that would deal not only with the fundamental aspects of biology, but also with broader human issues, the questions of man's relationship to man. Initially, he wanted to create such an institute in Pittsburgh, but that didn't work out. He ended up turning his attention to the West Coast, to California, and on a visit to La Jolla, the northern part of San Diego, was just struck by the uncarved territory, the potential, and ended up making the decision that that would be the place where the new institute would be founded, with the support of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, March of Dimes, who believed in this next step in my father's own life and desires and interests. My father worked with Louis Kahn, an extraordinary architect in Philadelphia, on the design of the Institute. It was a collaborative undertaking. I want to just point out that, as we see some pictures in a moment, that initially there were three components to the Institute in concept. Over on the left, in this model, was where the laboratory buildings would be. Those buildings were built. What was not built was down on the side towards me, at the end of the little point, you'll see another cluster or another building which was going to be a meeting center. That never was built. And that was going to be a place where, let me rewind for a second, in the Articles of Incorporation of the Institute, there were three purposes stated. The first was that this would be an institution to undertake research development and research education and training in biology, to understand how the system works if you're going to do anything with it, and the cause, prevention, and cure, treatment of disease. The third purpose was to understand those factors and circumstances conducive to the fulfillment of man's biological potential. What do we have within us to become? And to serve that purpose, the idea was to have a place, a meeting center, to bring together people from not only the biological sciences, but also the social sciences, the humanities, the arts, to deal with significant problems and challenges confronting humanity that can't be solved in the laboratory. So that was part of the initial design and desire for the Institute. Accompanying that, there was going to be some residences for visiting people to come through and engage in those kinds of conversations. This is just to give you a sense of the land at the time in 1960. Actually, the buildings were started in around 1962-63, where the Institute was built. In the middle is where the buildings were going to be created, and this is an aerial view from offshore, looking at the site. It was in the middle of nowhere, so to speak. The University of California, San Diego had just started up, small cluster of buildings. The rest of the land was open and unused. It's now full of university neighbors, research centers, and so on. This is the structure after it was completed, an absolutely amazing physical place that creates a feeling and an ambience for someone being there, and for the people who work there. It just seems to draw something very deep internally, and create an environment in which people can be creative and in a way that draws in many different sort of collaborative and interactive relationships. The Institute over the years has become one of the top biological research institutes in the world, doing research in neurosciences, genetics, metabolism, plant biology, the immune system, infectious disease. It's an extraordinary place that is doing very strong fundamental work in these areas, some of which has already led to practical applications as far as disease is concerned. I'll just point out, we may not get to talk about this later, the fellow up in the upper left is Fred Gage, or Rusty Gage, who's done some interesting work that I may or may not say anything more about, but I just wanted to point it out for the moment. Okay, so let's see what to do here. Okay. Yeah. In my father's own laboratory, and I had the opportunity to work with him for about 13 years at the Institute after I completed my own medical training. He was focusing on three different areas. One had to do with cancer and the immune system, and the other side of the coin. With cancer, as far as the immune system is concerned, you'd like to have the immune system stronger to resist the growth of something that's, in a sense, foreign to the body. The other side of that immunological coin is autoimmune disease, things like multiple sclerosis, where the immune system is doing too much, is doing damage to your own normal tissues. Then at the very end of his life, after his lab was already closed, he spent a good deal of attention and effort on developing an immunogen, or a vaccine, so to speak, to control HIV infection with an initial focus on people who already were infected with HIV. And the idea this would be a direction to pursue, using the same killed vaccine principle to pursue as a preventive vaccine for AIDS. I won't go into more detail on that at the moment. In addition, my father continued to pursue that same general desire to understand how we could make the world a better place through understanding our own nature. He wrote 4 books. The first was Man Unfolding. The second was The Survival of the Wisest. The third, with my youngest brother Jonathan, was A World Population and Human Values, A New Reality. And finally, Anatomy of Reality, Merging of Intuition and Reason. I want to give you just a bit of a flavor of some of the thinking. This is an image that relates to world population. For thousands of years, the human population grew very, very slowly. But then in the last several hundred years, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, so much more knowledge has been gained to allow us to do things that we couldn't do, that the population has risen exponentially. A huge increase has never happened before. And that's represented by the curve with the label A. The question is, how long can this go on? We're living on a finite planet. It's just not possible for the population to continue to grow and grow and grow without limits. So with that being an impossibility, what are the other possibilities? One would be if we followed the same kind of scenario that would happen if you have a population of deer in an environment and they overgraze the environment and eat up all of the food. The curve labeled C shows the results of that kind of an experience, which would certainly not seem to be a desirable one for us. The more positive kind of an outcome would be represented by the curve that's labeled B, which is that after this period of increasing and increasing and increasing growth, that there would be a bending in the curve. A point of inflection would be reached, and the curve would start to slope down, to bend over and reach a plateau. And that kind of S-shaped curve, represented by B, is called a sigmoid curve. And that's seen very typically in nature in a number of situations. For example, if you take a couple of fruit flies and put them in a closed container and continue to feed them, their population will initially increase exponentially, but then somehow the fruit flies know that within this environmental constraint, they have to do something to modify their reproduction, and their population will indeed plateau in that kind of way. And do the same thing with cells from the body and put them in tissue culture, and they'll grow exponentially, but they once they begin to get confluent, if they're normal cells, their growth is inhibited and the same kind of phenomenon is seen. So the question is, what are the dynamics involved here? What is it that drives this kind of a desirable, a hopeful outcome? What my father thought was that if you take that S-shaped curve, there are two different parts to it. One is the first part where it's this constant increase in the growth rate, and then the second part where it's leveling off. And what he thought as far as it being human is concerned, that there are different qualities and values and attributes and behaviors that characterize life in those two different portions of the sigmoid curve. That when growth is the emphasis in the first part, some of our human qualities, like competition, like the overcoming external constraints, a self-centered attitude towards our, that we're most important, or our family, or our tribe, or our nation, that these are factors that may dominate in that period. But when the dominance is not, the dominant influence is not more and more numbers, but rather a leveling off of numbers, where the emphasis becomes on quality rather than on quantity. What may be more important for us to be successful in that part of the growth curve is not competition, but cooperation. Not overcoming external constraints, but imposing self-restraints. Not the self-centered attitude, but one of mutualism. And that life in these two different phases, and that's why the subtitle of that book, World Population and Human Values, A New Reality, that life is in reality different. It's one thing to live in the first portion where everything is getting more and more. It's another thing to be living when we have to now to take responsibility for ourselves and live in a sustainable fashion. One way of looking at it is that, especially now in this period of rapid growth, we have acquired so much knowledge that has given us so much capability to do things we hadn't been able to do before. But now the requirement is going to be on developing the wisdom to use this knowledge appropriately. So, having given that flavor of the way my father saw the world and thought about the world, let's go back to the polio story. After the vaccine was approved, people were immunized in large numbers, and very quickly the incidence of polio began to fall, whereas the number of cases, the top line is the total number of cases of polio, the dashed line below it is the number of paralytic cases, had been increasing when the inactivated polio vaccine was introduced in 1955. The cases fell markedly by the end of 6 years in 1961. There's been a 97% decrease in the incidence of polio in this country. And at that point, the oral vaccine was introduced, which you're all familiar with, that had been produced by Dr. Albert Sabin, which is a different kind of vaccine. It's based on the use of living virus, like going back to that old idea, which is a perfectly valid one, where the virus has been weakened in such a way that it causes infection, but the idea is that it will not cause disease. So it's a perfectly reasonable way of going about immunizing against disease. So when the injected vaccine was used, the first vaccine, Sweden and Finland were two other countries that never did use the oral vaccine. They only relied on the original injected vaccine. And this is the same kind of curve, except it's a logarithmic scale or semi-logarithmic scale. So the number of cases were 1,000 before. Let's see. This is starting before. It's at 1,000 cases. The vaccine introduced, and then it dropped to 100 to 10 to 1. And within a number of years, the poliovirus was completely gone from those two countries. You couldn't even find it in the sewage. This is the picture of what happened in the United States, where again the kill vaccine was introduced, the incidence of polio began to fall. Then in 1961, the live vaccine, the Sabin vaccine was introduced, and the number of cases of polio caused by the wild, naturally occurring virus fell, and also in this country reached 0. The problem was that the weakened viruses used in the oral vaccine have the capacity to revert back to virulent form in some cases. And the reason is that the weakening is the result of a few mutations in the genes that, because the technology that was available back then, that was all that could be done, and those can mutate back to allow the virus to revert to a pathogenic form. So what was seen in this country is that, and that's this more solid line that's the live virus vaccine associated cases, there was a continuing incidence of somewhere around 8 to 12 cases of polio every year in this country that was caused by the vaccine itself. And that went on for a couple of decades until finally, at the end of the 20th century, and by 2000, the oral vaccine was stopped here, and this country now is only using the injected vaccine because of this issue, because of its safety. Now, the live vaccine is being used around the world as part of the global polio eradication initiative to immunize children, particularly in those parts of the world which one might think about in terms of being the developing world, to get rid of the remaining cases of polio in the world. And Rotary has been a major driver of this undertaking. They've done a heroic job of raising funds for this, I think over $1 billion up to this point, and without Rotary this wouldn't have happened. It's also been, the spearheading partners include, besides Rotary, the World Health Organization, the US CDC, and UNICEF, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been a major supporter in recent years of this effort. As a result of this eradication initiative, which started in 1988, the countries, at the time that the initiative started, already polio was naturally occurring polio was gone in the United States, and parts of Europe, parts of Latin America, and Australia. At the start of the initiative, there were 125 countries in which naturally occurring polio existed. By 2012, there were only 5 countries in which that was the case. So all the green countries, no more naturally occurring polio. The 3 countries in red, which are Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria, have never to this day gotten rid of the wild polio virus. And in 2012, there were 2 other countries next to Nigeria which had been reinfected with the virus. So this was, 2012 was the best year. There were only 223 cases of naturally occurring polio in that year. I'm going to just add a little footnote to this, because I started to look at this myself a number of years ago when I'd been invited by Rotary to give a talk, and I knew I really needed to get my understanding up to date about the eradication program, and look back because I was curious to know how the numbers stacked up. How much of polio that remained in the world was naturally occurring, the wild virus, and how much was related to the use of the oral vaccine. And it turned out, on analysis, that in the first decade of this century, from 2000 to 2010, about a quarter of the cases of polio in the world were related to the vaccine. Actually, in 2012, there were twice as many cases of polio caused by the vaccine as by the naturally occurring virus. So this was a stimulus for people to be, not my analysis, this was already being thought about, that something needed to be done to get to the end of the eradication program. And in addition to polio that might be caused in someone who received the oral vaccine themselves, or spread to an immediate contact, such as a mother changing diapers and so on, it's turned out that these viruses can continue to mutate and get to a point where they can spread and cause epidemics of their own. So that's an issue that persists. So there are two fundamental issues now that need to be dealt with. And here's sort of a picture of what's been going on. These are recent data. This is Nigeria. Polio, about the last year or so, spread from Nigeria again into countries that had not been infected recently, but have gotten rid of polio: Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and the Horn of Africa. Pakistan has been the source of spread of virus into Afghanistan, into Syria. Syria most recently the virus has spread into Iraq. There's been a virus present in Egypt, although no cases, and also into Israel. So what have we got to do if we're going to get the job done? Back to that. So the two issues is handling the vaccines appropriately, and the other is that we've still got these areas where it's the human problems that are at the basis of what we're facing. Parts of Pakistan where there's resistance to vaccine, to the use of the vaccine, where even the vaccinators, primarily young women, have been killed because of wanting to stop this program based on either religious differences or cultural differences or even political factors. This is a really tough thing to deal with, and there are similar things that have, pushing the wrong buttons, similar things that have taken place in Nigeria. That we've got to come to terms with this if we're going to be successful. And in a strange way, it's almost as if, as far as my father and his life and his thinking are concerned, things have come full circle. Because if we're going to get rid of this disease, it's not just the tools, but it's the human factors. It's man's relationship to man. It's these fundamental issues that we've got to be successful in being able to come to a different way of relating amongst ourselves if we're going to succeed even in what would otherwise seem to be a purely medical or scientific situation. So the game plan now is that the original injected vaccine will be introduced into all countries, the ones that are now currently used, where the oral vaccine is being used, which will provide a basis for ultimately being able to make a transition and to stabilize the situation so that new viruses won't be reintroduced. In 2010, there were 56 countries that were using only the injected vaccine, which included the United States and Europe and Australia. The countries in white were using, 121 countries using only the oral vaccine. So it's beginning to change, and the original vaccine is being brought back. I wanted to have you just experience very briefly my father in his own words. So I'll show two little clips of the things that he had to say in the latter part of his life.
As a child, I was not interested in science. I was really interested in things human. If you like, the human side of nature. And I continue to be interested in that. That's what motivates me. And in a way, it's the human dimension that has intrigued me. The idea of evolution by design, designing the future, anticipating the future. I think of the need for more wisdom in the world to deal with the knowledge that we have. At one time we had wisdom but little knowledge. Now we have a great deal of knowledge, but do we have enough wisdom to deal with that knowledge? And I define wisdom as the capacity to make retrospective judgments prospectively. And I think these are human qualities, human attributes that need to be brought out, need to be drawn upon, need to be valued.
So I think we're at the end of the presentation. My father died in 1995 at the Salk Institute. At the entry to the courtyard, one of my quotes from a talk that my father gave in 1977 in India. He was presenting with the Jawaharlal Nehru Award for International Understanding. And those words are that hope lies in dreams, in imagination, and in the courage of those who dare to make dreams into reality. I just have to say again, to go back to the beginning, that this is something that you exemplified, that the courage to have done what you've done with your lives. I think all of this gives real hope for the future. So thanks.
Haven't we been very privileged to have Dr. Salk with us this afternoon? Now, because we are endlessly capable of improvisation, you can see that our wonderful staff is very quietly serving salad. But we can go right on with questions and answers if Dr. Salk is willing to do that right now. And just don't worry about, because the staff here are well used to being very quiet as they do their very best to serve with it almost noiselessly. And you can even start to eat. So we will go right on, and we thank you so much for your patience and your willingness to help us improvise.
What I'm interested in is, I'm sure you've heard about that new illness that's come out in the media about an illness with polio-like features. Is your institute studying that?
The Salk Institute is not directly studying that. And I should say that at the moment I don't have a direct affiliation with that. I've been working with my father for some time. The reports, well, you've all heard the question. The reports, especially in California, of children who are experiencing what looks like polio but is not being caused by the polio virus. As far as I understand, it's not yet known what is going on in those situations. It is known that there are other viruses that are similar to polio, they're called enteroviruses, that can, on occasion, cause paralytic illness. So there have been enteroviruses, a couple of types, isolated from children who have had this experience, but in others, not. So whether this is responsible, this kind of a viral illness is responsible for these particular cases, or whether there's something else going on, that's not known. There are cases of paralysis that occur around the world that are not caused by the polio virus. So to the extent that there may be other viruses that can cause this kind of illness, that will need to be approached through more research and conceivably through other vaccines.
Regarding the use of the oral vaccine, one of the reasons that the efficacy and the ability to get these vaccines to these foreign reaches of lands, India, etc., where the injectable was the storage and the cooling and so forth and so on. So it's my understanding that a lot of the oral vaccine had the ability to travel easier than the injectables.
I think that there are a number of reasons why the choice was made to use the oral vaccine. one of them is so simple to administer. The Rotarians have gone to countries to administer the vaccine themselves. It doesn't require special medical training. And I should say, the oral vaccine has done a fantastic job. I don't think I emphasized that enough. That this program, all of the success that you've seen was due to, in those countries, was due to the use of the oral vaccine. So there's no question that has been an extraordinarily effective procedure. Now, in terms of the final stage, that's when the issues come to the fore. There are issues of cost, and there's another point that I need to raise. It's another little piece of complexity, which is that it had long been thought that one of the strengths of the oral vaccine would be its ability to provide immunity strong immunity in the intestinal tract. And there are studies that were done that showed that the injected vaccine also produced immunity in the intestines, but not as strong as that produced by the oral vaccine. So a recent observation has been that while poliovirus has shown up again in Israel, Israel in 2005 started to go, as the United States went back to the use only of the injected killed vaccine. So it's been found that the live wild virus is circulating in some people in the Israeli population, even who have been immunized. It's not caused any polio. Those people have been protected by that barrier that I showed in that early slide, so they're not becoming paralyzed, but the virus is able to grow in the intestines and spread. So what Israel has done is to start immunizing again with the oral vaccine in an effort to induce stronger immunity in the intestinal tract. So we've got these complexities to deal with. In a way, there might be two different approaches ultimately that could be looked into and followed. Is it possible to make a live vaccine that will not have the ability to mutate back and to end up causing paralysis in some cases? That would be one path. It would be an ideal path, conceivably an ideal path to pursue. Another approach might be to add what's called an adjuvant, which is a substance that can be added to a vaccine. There are a number of different types that would strengthen its ability to induce immunity in the intestinal tract. So that's another path that might be pursued. At the moment, somehow I think the game plan would be to orchestrate the use of the two vaccines in a way that would lead to being able ultimately to stop all vaccination. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Salk, for being here. This has been a dream of mine to actually meet somebody that was related to the original person that changed the polio world. The question that I have for you is more about your life, walking in or following in the footsteps of your dad, and what has that been for you? How has your life been because of what your dad's work was?
There's no question, but did everyone hear that okay? I think so. I hope so. It's hard to be associated with a person like my father and not to be influenced. I have two younger brothers, and all three of us, despite having interests in other realms, ended up going to medical school, not because of any pressure from my father or mother that we should do that, but just having that example in front of us is, in terms of his commitment to the world and what he wanted to see in the way of positive change. There was sort of like a weight behind a boat with a vacuum that pulled us in that direction. So there's no question that it had a great influence on me. And what I'm doing now is focusing on my father and his history and his life and his legacy, with the questions of what can we learn from what he did, what can we learn from the success that took place. And how can we take this especially appeals to me. There's still the polio eradication effort that needs to be completed. There are other of his medical ideas that still deserve pursuit. But the one that really, the thing that really grips me personally is this whole question about these broad challenges facing us now. With what we're experiencing, with climate change, with population growth, with continuation of poverty, with war, and the difficult interactions that we have on all levels. Just would like to see us come to grips with these issues, bringing people together from a variety of disciplines, thinking together, how can we now confront not only the challenges but the opportunities that we have to make this world a better place. So that's what I'd like to see happen. And this year and a half, or 2 years of the Centenary period, I want to use this as a platform. The foundation that was set up to try and help coordinate this, the Jonas Salk Legacy Foundation, to use this as a platform for moving ahead in these various realms. I'm happy in either direction. I can take it to one question.
Why don't we do this? All right. Let's have a round of applause. 1 minute. Now, why don't we let Dr. Salk have his lunch while we finish our salad, and after the entree is served, if time permits, and there are a few more questions, then perhaps he can entertain those. But I'm very mindful of his schedule. I know that he can't stay, too long because he has a plane to catch, and he's being picked up at 3 p.m. or at 3 p.m. So enjoy your lunch, and when it is interrupted again, whatever Dr. Salk's time is, I will have some really nice things to tell you before we all adjourn our conference. Okay? So enjoy. John? So we'll have 2 questions, and I see one hand is, yes, that's Mary Ann. And if there's one other question, that's from Betsy. Now that's it, okay? And he's going to come up, and he's going to take your question. And then I have some nice announcements that I think you'll all enjoy.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is very brief, so maybe it only counts as half a question. What is the best biography of your father?
That is a good question, and it's complicated because there really isn't an actual biography of him. There was a wonderful book that was written, it was published in 1966 by Richard Parker called Breakthrough, the saga of Jonas Salk, which dealt with that early vaccine period. And so the question had to do with thank you, I can hear the difference. had to do with the best biography on my father, and there really isn't one that's current. There was a book by Richard Carter, published in 1966, called The Saga, called Breakthrough, the Saga of Jonas, Salk, which is out of print, and I sort of look upon that as the Bible. It really goes to a very detailed fashion what happened around the development of the polio vaccine. There are some very nice books on polio, and which include that part of that story. There's a book by David Oshinsky called Polio, which won a Pulitzer Prize, a book by Jeffrey Kluger, and there's another biography that's in the works now by a woman named Charlotte Jacobs, who's a physician at Stanford. That's not come out, and I don't know much about it, but that's on the horizon.
So it's breakthrough.
Yeah, and you may or may not be able to find it.
As well. Okay, thank you very much.
Hi.
We can take the other half. Do it, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is about your philosophy or your belief about the current rush to immunize everyone against influenza, including people who are perfectly healthy and have never had the flu. They don't get cold, don't do drugs and surgery.
Yeah, it's a really difficult issue, and I know that there are people who feel uncomfortable about the notion of vaccination. Let me step back to my own life, because that's something I know about. Because I had to deal with this question as a parent, not with respect to influenza, but with respect to the other childhood immunizations. And we have my wife and I have a son, Michael, who's 30 at this point. When he was young, was at the point where the DPT, the diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus shot, there were problems with the pertussis, the whooping cough component, because it had to be purified at that point. And it was known that there were reactions with fevers and there might even be seizures on some occasions. So we had a difficult decision to make. We had a difficult decision to make with our own son about what to do about diphtheria, whooping cough, tetanus immunization many years ago when he was young, because of the potential side effects. And for me personally, I just came to the feeling that even though there was not that much risk of the disease at that point, because so many people have been immunized, that I just did myself, I couldn't make the decision not to immunize him, because I didn't want personally to contribute to a situation where immunization rates would fall and people would end up with more risk. So that was just a personal decision on my part, and I recognize that there's a dilemma in that kind of setting. So on the one hand, I really feel that it's important for immunization to be kept up, whether it's against polio, measles, or what have you, so that we don't see the kinds of resurgence of those diseases that we are experiencing now. When I was younger myself, and the question of flu immunization against influenza came up, which is not perhaps the same thing in a way. I went for years without getting flu shots, much to my father's horror, given his own relationship with that disease, and I just somehow didn't want to. But I saw people who got really sick with flu, and finally just ended up deciding for myself, I don't want to go through that. So I'm going to, even if I'm going to get a sore arm from it, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. I can't give you a good answer for everybody, and I know that people have different feelings about it. So you just see how I've handled things on my own side, and I do recognize the importance of protection and not spreading disease. So I don't know how best to approach this in a general case. How do we deal with people having one set of feelings and then there being other feelings about the public health aspect of things? I don't know what the good resolution is.
Now, Larry had
Yes.
He said half a question, so we'll let him ask his half question. He'll go cheating a little bit, but you're entitled to give him half an answer.
Yes, I had a very interesting question, which I just realized when I saw the clips. Did your dad ever meet Albert Einstein?
No,
Philosophies are similar.
yeah, the two men did not meet. He had a huge respect for Albert Einstein, but there just was not a point in which their paths crossed during his lifetime. He had some very important interactions with other major physicists, with Oppenheimer and Polio that were very fruitful, but Einstein no.
Well-deserved applause, and thank you again so much, Dr. Salk. Now, if you can bear with me, all kinds of nice things to say, which I will try to say as briefly as possible. First of all, I do want to thank Clifton and Courtney, who've been shepherding us from the hotel through our day here and meeting emergencies and doing all kinds of good things, and George, who has been a great help to Lee in producing our audiovisual materials. And of course, that means an extra, you're going to have to clap again, because we wouldn't be able to do this without Lee. So our okay. Now, Rotary has figured in our conversation today quite a bit, and we're very Rotary-minded. And I'm going to ask that the microphone be given to our board member, John Nanny, if that would be possible for George to, and John is, do you want to come up, John? You can do it from there. He's right here, George, because he has something really exciting to tell you, that he has worked, separate mic, go ahead. So here's John Nanny, who was from New Jersey, but is now living in Delaware, but that's okay.
Yes, we have always been concerned about accessibility, and I'm a Yankee fan, and I'm a season ticket holder at Yankee Stadium. And with the new Yankee Stadium, I found out that prior to any engineer ever designing the new Yankee Stadium, they commissioned a handicap group to discuss accessibility. And I want to tell you that there is not one place in all of Yankee Stadium, including the dugout, that I can't get to where I have to leave my seat, will have to leave my chair. And on top of that, the Yankees have a disabled services office that is beyond compare. They bend over backwards to help all these kids that you see them come in that are totally immobile. They have a helper, they have feeding tubes, but you can see the look on their face and the experience that they would have that normally would not be able to have watching a game in person. So the board has decided that we wanted to honor the Yankees, and through having to deal with a number of different offices, we finally Friday got the notification from them that we're not sure what date, but there's going to be a day game this year that we're going to be able to go on the field prior to a game and present a plaque to the Yankees in honor of their great service to the disabled community.
John said we, but it's John who's done this.
And Murray, who's been.
And Murray. Murray is a veteran Yankee. Wave your hand, Murray, just in case anybody doesn't know. Yeah, do you also have season tickets, or do you just go occasionally? Go occasionally, but still, you're a loyal fan. And so, isn't that a wonderful thing? I mean, I think that's just great, and thank you, John, very, very much. Now, we're not finished with Rotary, because here today is our old friend, longtime member, Bill Mielia, from the Elizabeth, New Jersey Rotary Club. And every year, Elizabeth Rotary makes a contribution to the Polio Network of New Jersey. And I think what I would like George to do is to give, good, here comes the microphone. Bill is seated up here in front, and he's going to say a few words.
Very few. But on behalf of the Rotary Club of Elizabeth, it's a pleasure for me to present this check to be used for the Rubric Fund. And earlier today, you enunciated how well this has been used, and it's beneficial to a lot of folks like us.
Individual, that's right.
So,
That's right.
it's a great pleasure to be able to give this on behalf of the Elizabeth Rotary.
Good. And why don't you give it to Lottie, who's right here on our board, and Lottie she's very careful with money. Putting it right in her pocket. Okay. That's wonderful, and thank you, Bill, and of course, Elizabeth Rotary will get our formal letter of thanks, but it's so nice that Bill is here to present this check in person. Thank you so much again. Now, I have to tell you a little story, because Dr. Salk has been wonderful about complimenting us on how we persevere and we get things done. There are two people in this room who made such strenuous efforts to get to this event that I really have to tell you about it. And they are Monica Napoleon and Veronica, tell me your last name. Washam. Yeah, I know the name well, but you know, every once in a while I forget a name. And I knew it was W, and I couldn't quite remember the rest of it. And Veronica Washam likes to be known as Ronnie. So I did remember that, Ronnie. Because sometimes when they travel together or in, what shall I say, in tandem, they get mixed, Veronica and Monica get mixed up. so Veronica likes to be known as Ronnie. Now they live in the same building but in different apartments in New York City. And how many places, Monica, did you try to get transportation to this event?
Between the two of us,
about 20 different car services that would take power chairs to no avail. So they came on New Jersey Transit. By pre-arrangement with New Jersey Transit, so there was plenty of accommodation for 2 power chairs. And they came last night, and Lottie and my husband Jim, who are sitting side by side in separate vans, went over to Bloomingdale's in the mall in Bridgewater Commons and picked them up and brought them to the hotel. And so they were able to be here. Good. Obviously, you can appreciate what effort that took. And they are, their scheduled bus is 4:45 this afternoon, again, from Bloomingdale, just up the road at Bridgewater Commons. Now, if there's anyone with a van who can leave his or her wheelchair or scooter here and take one of the ladies back to Bridgewater Commons in front of Bloomingdale's, that would be lovely. Don't think that, we have a plan, but it would make things easier if someone who is leaving, the event and who has van availability, what it would mean is you'd have to, I think, leave your motorized vehicle here, your personal vehicle, go over and then come back. Or if somebody has a van that takes 2 motorized chairs or scooters, then perhaps one could fit in. So if there's anybody who has that capability, let me know after lunch, okay? But again, they're not stranded, you know, they'll be taken care of, but it would sort of ease things a bit if that could be done. Okay, but aren't they wonderful to do that? I mean, it's just terrific. Now, this is our first event, to my knowledge, where we had a baby. And I want to introduce to you Mona, who was Mona Khalil, and her husband Hani, and say your last name real loud. They're in the back. Honey, say your last name real loud because it's hard to pronounce for me. Michel, and how do you say it? There's little Theodora, or Dora, and she is just a wonderful little baby. And so it's our first. Mona and Hani are from Egypt and have been here in this country for several years and are here to stay. And we're just so happy that they are in our group. Now, I've told you a lot about my interest in Centers for Independent Living and how our Ruprecht Fund is administered so that we board members can be impartial. We don't get involved. If a person living in New Jersey meets our criteria for a grant from the Ruprecht Fund, it's all done through Heightened Independence and Progress, otherwise known as HIP. And both Lottie and I are privileged to be members of that board. Now, here comes the pitch. Last year, we started our calendar raffle for the first time, and it proved to be so popular. If those of you who know about calendar raffles want to wave your hand or whatever, then that will tell me that there are some knowledgeable people about oh, good, some hands. It means that from the first Monday in June to the last Friday in August, up to 65 prizes, small cash prizes, will be awarded, all for the investment of one $20 ticket. And last year, one of our people who was here at this event won. And so that was great fun. And of course, I have a few calendar raffle tickets, which when things are over, if anybody wants to take a chance for $20, or if you're not prepared today, but would like to think about it for later on, you have between now and May 31st to get in touch with me, and I will make sure that you get a ticket. Ruth Fiedler, where is Ruth? Wave your hand a minute, Ruth. Is Ruth here? One of our most ardent supporters of the calendar raffle is Dorothy McDowell. And those of us who've been around for a long time know Dorothy and remember her well. She couldn't be here today, but she reminded me about a month ago, where is my calendar raffle ticket? I want to join again. So we're well known in the community. And now I'm going to ask Heather if she will come up and bring with her Heather Broad, who is our Bergen County Polio Support Group leader. And she and Lottie and I, can you come up? Or do you want to just stay down there? Okay. We have two prizes. If you noticed, and if you didn't, as soon as lunch is over, well, whoever wins these two prizes, please don't rip them off their, their stand. I should have maybe pointed this out earlier. A lady in the state of Washington, a polio survivor, I was introduced to her through a mutual friend who lives in Chicago. And her name is Janine Stevens. And Janine, in retirement, just for fun, makes little comforters. And so because we were introduced on the phone by our friend, Janine said, I'm going to make you a comforter. And I said, oh, no, you don't have to do that, Janine. She said, oh, I insist, I'm going to make you a comforter. It's fun. So I said, tell you what, instead of making one for me, if you want to make a comforter, send it, and it will be a prize at our next post-polio conference. So she said, oh, all right, I'll do that, but I'll also make one for you. About 3 weeks later, a package came in the mail, and it had not only a little, knee-sized comforter for me, but she'd made 2 comforters as prizes for the polio conference. And one for a man and one for a lady. But to me, they're both acceptable, unisex, whatever. Now, every person here who has come, the name is in the bag that Heather is holding. And she is going to draw 2 names. And those 2 people will win the comforters, which are hanging outside. I wonder if there's anybody who could bring them in. Is that possible? Oh, good. Oh, Heather, that's great. I think you want to see what everybody wants to see what they're getting. And they're in a little bit of an odd place because there was just so much going on, okay? So Lottie is going to draw 2 names, and she's very honest,
She's holding that check, she better be honest.
She's going to close her eyes, she's going to reach into the bag, and she's going to pull out 2 names. And here are the comforters being brought in by 2 very nice people. Thank you so much. There's Vera. Okay, very good. Now comes a big problem. Does Vera get to choose which one she wants? Oh, John says absolutely. All right, which one do you want, Vera? The red and blue? Okay, very good. As you can see, my friend Janine, my telephone friend Janine, thought that red and blue were for girls, and that this jungle animal, thing was for boys. Okay, Lottie is going to draw ticket number 2. Why she's taking it? Okay. Sharon Murnane? Yes. Sharon Murnane. Where are you, Sharon? Oh, did Sharon not come? Sharon, are you here? Well, too bad. No, I think you have to be present. Don't you think that's fair? Yeah. I knew you'd say that.
Oh, the Terry family.
Say that?
Terry.
Oh, Barbara and Robert Terry from New York City. Okay, wave your hand, Barbara and Robert.
Oh, there they are.
Over there, okay? Wonderful, very good. Barbara is a member of our, now, by the way, this brings up an interesting point. We in Bergen County are getting people from New York City and beyond. And here's Robert. Again. Listen, if I recognize myself, Gary, I'm lucky. Don't you think, Gary and Robert don't look that much different, right? There's a family resemblance. That's right. Okay. Well, I think that's wonderful. And I'm going to let Janine Stevens know that 2 very lovely people won her comforters. And you'll find her name mentioned on the back of your program. Okay? Now, I think that I've covered everything. So, don't forget your evaluation sheets, and if you prefer to do your evaluation online, Lee, can we count on you to put the evaluation sheet on our website, okay? And I'm sorry we didn't get to have a special meeting for newcomers. Only one person actually responded to the newcomer request. But I know there are other newcomers here, but we just didn't know they were newcomers until it was too late. But keep in touch with us, and we will be more than happy to fill in with any questions that you may have. And it looks to me as if our friend Dr. Salk is leaving us, right? And so we'll say goodbye to him. Oh, Jim is, of course, taking a picture. Oh, wonderful. That's a great picture. Oh, it'll take him a second. Very good. Okay. Well, folks, if anybody has a comment that you want to make, feel free, or a question of a general nature that isn't involved with, our medical specialist, but is involved with our network, I'll try to answer it. Okay? Or else enjoy your dessert and coffee, and maybe we'll call this adjournment. Okay? Take care. Come back next year.
Yeah, the board meeting. Or you bring it there then?
Yeah, I'll bring it right there and we'll grab some more.
Thank you.
Thank you.